Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our read-along of Henry Trollope's Phineas Redux, the fourth of his Palliser novels, and the direct sequel to his novel Phineas Finn. This is a long parliamentary novel about the title character, Phineas Finn, who in Phineas Finn, at the end, retires to his home in Ireland and almost looks like the narrative has seen the last of him. And Trollope was enough of a workhorse to leave some of that up to his readers and to the book-buying public. Did they make that book a success? But he was also a writer in his own right. People they sell him short, I think, as a writer. And in all fairness, they do so with his direct encouragement, because the people who read his autobiography, he wrote an autobiography. It was published posthumously, and it was a long-burning but very intense scandal of a literary kind. Not because he named names and said that he actually carried on a clandestine affair with Benjamin Disraeli, but because he laid out the author's world, his world, of so many words an hour, so many words a work session. Start exactly here, end exactly here. Work on the plotting and outlining section of one book while you're working on the writing part of another book and the editing part of a third book. And the problem here, it's going to sound odd to say, but the problem here is that people took Trollope's autobiography at his word. His Victorian readers took his autobiography at his word. And everybody else has too. And if you only have to read Trollope's novels themselves to see that these are not the work of someone who was working on a timetable, measuring cloth, and not caring about it. That was an affect that he put forward in his autobiography, as much a device against the highfalutin nature of some of the literary quarters of his day that he hated, as a legitimate reportage of the truth. If you've read along with these Trollope novels that we've been doing now, or if you've read other Trollope, or maybe even, God forbid, you've read a biography of Trollope, then you will know, even from the novels, you would be able to tell that this is not the kind of guy who's going to write spiritual epiphanies in his autobiography. In fact, he's going to go out of his way not to. And he did. And people took him at his word. And they don't read between the lines in the autobiography the way they're happy to do in the novels that he wrote. But the reason I bring that up is because, yes, Trollope wanted to see if the reading world, liked Phineas Finn. But he also had a story in mind to tell. And it wasn't complete at the end of Phineas Finn. So a few years later, he brings the character back. Phineas had retired to Ireland to a salaried position and a meek, lovely little wife. And he loses the salaried position, and he loses the meek, lovely little wife, and he returns to the hurly-burly of London politics. And in the chapters we've been reading so far, he is reintroduced to that world, and we're reintroduced to it right with him. We saw that world afar in the Eustace Diamonds, but we hardly ever had in that was a thriller novel, a crime caper novel. And Trollope did it well, I think, but we had hardly more than glimpses of the dear old friends that we knew, the temperamental Lord Chiltern and his lovely wife, Violet Effingham, the sad, doomed Lady Laura Standish, who marries Mr. Kennedy, a wealthy Scottish landowner who's a little bit of a prig and who turns out to be much worse than that. And most of all, the high corridors of power. There's secondary characters like Barrington Erle or the Duke of Tono Bungay or the Duke of St. Bungay, Tono Bungay. I've got H.G. Wells on the mind, but also the main characters. Plantagenet Palliser, who in the books that we read before was the heir to the Duke of Omnium, and his wife, Lady Glencora Palliser, who, has, in the course of the novels that we've seen, they've worried about whether or not they're going to have children. They've overcome that obstacle. And now the obstacle that we saw last time is that when the old Duke dies, Plantagenet Palliser becomes the Duke of Omnium. And that changes his life in ways that he doesn't like. It changes his Lady Glencora's life in ways that she does like. It gives her immense social power, the greatest social power aside from the Queen, because the Duke of Omnium is fantastically wealthy. The dukedom is the most grand in the land, with tons and tons of estates, lots and lots of money. And she also brought a ton of money to the marriage. And she wants to use all of that, but she's not able to do it as the wife of a guy in Parliament whose main passion is the decimal coinage. But when Plantagenet Palliser becomes the Duke of Omnium, it happens in the last 20 chapters that we read. All of his life changes. He can no longer sit in the House of Commons, for instance. He's not sure about his pet projects. But we get to revisit all of those people in this book. And in the 20 pages that we're reading today, we're starting off with Oh God, I never get this ready in time. We're starting off at the beginning of the second volume, what would have been the second volume for the Victorians, with a chapter called "I Hope I'm Not Distrusted," and we're reading all the way to 2 days before the trial, and in these chapters we switch from we start off with the emphasis falling on a different Palliser. Not Plantagenet Palliser, but an obscure cousin, a girl in the family, Adelaide Palliser, who in the chapters that we've read so far found herself the object of affection of two very different men. There was Mr. Spoon Hall, who was unexciting. He was rotund and ruddy-faced and upwards of 40, but he was a good, solid landowner, didn't owe any debts at all, and he wanted her to be his wife and come back to Spoon Hall. There was also Gerald Mall, a wastrel of a kind, very charismatic, very outgoing, very attractive, the son of a horribly reptilian boulevardier that doesn't like his son at all. Their relationship between Mall and Senior and Junior is standard in British fiction, actually, and reaches, I think, its pinnacle in Charles Ryder in Brideshead Revisited, whose father is. Well, if those of you who've read Brideshead will probably remember Mr. Ryder, and it's an amazingly withering job that Evelyn Waugh does. And in this book, it's equally withering. Trollope clearly does not like Mr. Mall Sr., but Gerald Mall he likes. And in the chapters that we're reading today, they meet at the home of Lord Chiltern, and Lord Chiltern has had a dissolute and very violent life. He's never been really on good footing with his father. And Violet Effingham loves him with a passion. They love each other. They are a love match, as the Regency period would have said. And in the beginning of these chapters, Lord Chiltern, of all people, is in a position to take Gerald Mall aside and say, well, look at here, old man, what are you planning to do? You don't have any money. Your father, he has the rights to Mall Priory, to the Mall family home in the country. He never goes there. He doesn't use it. He doesn't like it. He's a pure creature of London. But he has absolutely refused Gerald Mall and Adelaide from living there to defray their expenses. He's absolutely refused to do that. But Lord Chiltern points out to Gerald Mall in these pages that, your father could live another 20 or 30 years. What do you plan to do with no money and no place to live? Because Adelaide, despite the fact that she's a Palliser, has nothing. She has no money. That element is a little bit unrealistic. Trollope, I believe that Trollope plotted this thing with a different kind of resolution in mind, and then he was a fantastic plotter, and his plotter's mind figured out how he was going to end the story of Adelaide Palliser, and that's fine. Okay, when you get to that ending, you're to like it a lot, but the only way that the plot of Gerald Mall and Adelaide Palliser makes any sense at all in the book itself is if you already know that ending. Otherwise, first, it makes no sense that her family would give her nothing, would put her into the so-called marriage mart with no portion. And second, it makes no sense that she would, without that, would ignore the deficiencies of Gerald Mall as a lover, as a suitor. And yet she does ignore it. The only thing that turns her against him in the pages that we're reading now is himself. When he, with his conversation with Lord Chiltern on his mind, although he gives Chiltern a flea in his ear, he goes to her with that conversation on his mind, kind of hemming and hawing about what they'll do for expenses, and maybe they'll have to live, shudder, on the continent because their money might go further there, and that incenses her as it would any young woman. It sounds like he's getting cold feet. But watching them, gavotte around the subject of their relationship is I think really well done. It's done with a lot of spirit. Trollope sometimes fails that little plot line. It's one of his favorites. He goes back to it all the time. The young lovers, the course of true love. He goes back to it all the time. If I were Mrs. Trollope, I would not have been happy knowing that. But he doesn't fail in this book, I don't think. And in the 20 pages that we're reading now, that's I'm sure it was occupying your attention, how the ins and outs of Adelaide and Gerald's relationship. And that'll just about do it for our... Oh, what's that book too? What's that you're saying? Oh, that's right. Something else does happen in the chapters that we're reading. And I want to know what you think of it. I was telling you all along that it was coming. And I don't think any of you, if you didn't know this book, I don't think you've predicted it. If our last novel in the Palliser series was the Eustace Diamonds, and it was a thriller. There were all sorts of other things going on, definitely. There was a relationship, a weird relationship, a touching relationship between Madame Max Goesler and the old Duke. But the main story of that book was a what happens next thriller about the Eustace Diamonds and what Lizzie Eustace is doing with them and where they are and who gets to keep them and what's going to happen to them. And I bet you thought in the first half of this book that we were going to leave capers like that behind in this book, but no. No. Phineas Finn is in London. He is a political creature, and he is attracted to himself because he's a hottie. He has attracted a coterie of London political wives who cannot participate in politics themselves but have a very vested interest in how it goes. And they like Phineas Finn. They want to advance his career. The foremost of these political wives is Lady Glencora, who is accustomed to foot-stampingly getting her way. And she wades right into the thick of things. Phineas Finn has an adversary, Mr. Bonteen, who is also a political creature in London. Slightly more established, but also slightly more obnoxious. Lady Glen can't stand him. And she has two goals. In the last batch of chapters that we read, she had two goals, which was to deny Mr. Bonteen a place in government, an actual paid salary position in government or in the cabinet. And eventually she succeeds. So she blocks him from everything, and he has to take a non-cabinet position as president of the Board of Trade, which sounds like a big deal, but it's a big disappointment to him, and he lets everybody know it. But she fails in another thing. She fails to get Finn a position. And the fact that her interference is well known makes, of course, Phineas Finn and Mr. Bonteen enemies. That makes them political enemies. Mr. Bonteen is able at once to lay all of his disappointments at Phineas Finn's feet, even though Finn was arguing with these women behind the scenes not to help him, not to interfere like this. And Finn doesn't like Bonteen either. He's brusque and rude. They've had already a tense discussion in the previous bit of chapters that we read, and in this they have a much worse encounter, also at the Universe, a gentleman's club in London, where Mr. Bonteen has been drinking. Trollope is happy to tell us that he is not completely drunk, but he's one of those men who becomes obnoxious when they drink. Extra coarse, extra abrasive. And we'll go through it slowly here because it's so delectable. Phineas Finn is going to the club, of course. It's what you did. And he arrives with his friends. He has friends there as well as enemies. And he arrives just as he's hearing Mr. Bonteen loudly talk in a large group of his friends and mentioning that so-and-so would probably have made a play for Lizzie Eustace. And it isn't hard for Phineas Finn to realize that he's the person being talked about. And it's scandalous, because Lizzie Eustace, as much as you might, maybe some of you had a sneaking affection for her when we were reading the Eustace Diamonds, but she's social poison. And the idea, of course, is that the person wants her for her money. And Finn bridles at the idea and has some tense words with Mr. Bonteen until his friends sort of draw him away and try to calm him down. One friend, Mr. Monk, even says, "I'll gladly walk home with you. What you should do is go home and go to bed. Sleep this off. Don't stay here and stay irritated at this man. Yes, he's irritated. Yes, none of us like him, but it's not worth it. Don't do it. Don't do anything, especially not when, keep in mind, thanks to Phineas Finn's encounter in a hotel with the deranged Mr. Kennedy, there's a London newspaper editor who wants to pin any kind of scandal on Finn and is doing a really good job. The last thing you want to do is give Quintus Slide any more ammunition. His friends are urging him to just draw off and leave the club. Before he does, they're outside. Mr. Bonteen leaves. Trollope is a little bit too much of a gentleman to say that he staggers off, but he does leave the club. It's late at night. It's a dark night, we're told. No moon, no stars, lots of cloud cover. And Phineas Finn has in his pocket a life preserver. It's a kind of kosh. It's a kind of bludgeon, a small, handheld, heavy bludgeon that Victorian men did carry on their person. The streets could be very dark and very dangerous, and there was never a cop around when you needed one. And if you were, for instance, walking across a big patch of park, you could easily be accosted. Phineas Finn first meets Mr. Kennedy by saving him from just such an occasion. Although Phineas Finn doesn't have a weapon at the time, now he does. He has bought himself a weapon, a truncheon, a small truncheon that a man might carry around for his own personal protection. And when he's outside the club and Mr. Bonteen walks off, Finn is with his friends and he takes out his truncheon and makes a move with his hands. He's purely joking. Of course, he's purely joking. But nevertheless, he wanders off himself in the exact same direction, only a couple of hundred yards behind Mr. Bonteen, and in the next chapter we are told that Mr. Bonteen was found dead, bludgeoned to death with a truncheon. The police naturally get involved. Mr. Bonteen had also been fighting with Mr. Emilius, who we might remember from the Eustace times, a slimy preacher man who doesn't have an alibi and is known to be an enemy of the guy. The police sniff around him, and it doesn't take them long to realize that Phineas Finn had also fought with Mr. Bonteen and had been seen leaving the club immediately after Mr. Bonteen, walking in the same direction at night in as Lord Fawn. Some of you remember Lord Fawn from the Eustace times, a perfectly useless little weasel of a man. Lord Fawn gives testimony that, yeah, I saw someone certainly wearing Mr. Finn's coat. He had Mr. Finn's gait. I didn't actually see the face because the collar was up, but it was right at that time. It's like one of the characters says in here, Fawn might actually succeed in getting Finn hanged without even meaning to, without even having any malice to do it. The police also find a truncheon, and it's exactly the same kind that Phineas Finn has. So, those of you who read that chapter that I talked about last time, The Two Gladiators, might have thought you were in for the most parliamentary of parliamentary novels, and suddenly, halfway through, we're thrust into a murder mystery and a trial. A big, scary trial, with Phineas Finn literally on trial for his life, because his friends naturally report to the police that, yes, he did joke about using his truncheon on Mr. Bonteen. It looks very bad for Phineas Finn. In other words, as these chapters are going on, he is actually on trial. And it's all the talk of London, only unlike the Eustace times with Lizzie Eustace, this time the thing that is all the talk of London involves one of our friends and is much more serious. So I want to wrap up this discussion here by, I always ask this whenever I've taught this book, whenever I've led a book discussion group about it, whenever I talk to individual people about it, I always want to know, especially, I mean, I want to know the reactions of all of you, even if you've read this 10 times, but I want to know, especially the people who are reading this the first time, did you see that coming? And also, occasionally over the years, I have had first-time readers of this book say, oh, no, I don't want a contrived murder mystery in the middle of this thing. I was interested in a novel about Phineas Finn's rise in politics, about political compromises, about the rise of Plantagenet Palliser to the Dukedom of Omnium. I was interested in all that. Oh, I don't want another murder mystery. We just had a mystery novel in the Eustace times. Did any of you have that reaction? Or did you feel, I myself think, that Trollope's hand is just so sure carrying the reader along that I never have that reaction. I was pleased to take this book anywhere that Trollope went. But I'm curious to know if you did. So I'm going to wrap up this reading. Is a day late, I'm sorry. It was this chaos when you take a vacation. It might happen again, actually. I loved it so much that I might give my long-suffering host just enough time to recover and then inflict myself and freedom on them again. But in the meantime, we're just a day late. And I want to know all of your reactions to that turn of events, because this novel has a sudden turn halfway through. And that'll do it for today, and the next time ends it. The next time, let's go back to my table of contents here. The next time, let's see here. God, you'd think I would put a bookmark in this spot. Yes, the next time we go from the beginning of the trial all the way to the end, and the end is called Conclusion, which is ironic enough. But the chapter before that is At Last, At Last. And I know there are 4 of you right now, I know, who are going to get to the chapter At Last, and have a spiritual out-of-body experience. It's going to make you so happy. But before then, we have the darkest days of Phineas Finn's life. So we'll do that next Sunday. I don't think there's anything that will distract me from next Sunday. I don't think Frida and I are going anywhere until who knows. But so let me know, of course, in the comments field. Fill me with comments about what you thought of this. This was these 20 chapters. Trollope's stately progression of this man in politics took a right turn, a sudden right turn. So let me know what you thought. I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.